And in this episode, you'll hear how Megan Kierstead works with startups to get the most from their user research budgets and capabilities. Megan is a researcher and educator with over a decade of experience in helping companies of all shapes and sizes build products that solve real problems for real people. She has a BS from Wellesley College and an MS from UMass Amherst, with a strong focus in social science and anthropological research methods. Megan's passion is to create a generation of leaders who aren't afraid to be themselves. To that end, she runs a successful coaching business, helping her fellow badasses create meaningful careers. She lives in the Bay Area with her 3 bunnies and is typically either covered in flour or glitter. Megan, thanks so much for joining today. I know you've done a lot of work with startups on research. So where do you see startups struggle to understand their customers?
Um, Startups are interesting because a lot of people come to them having a preformed idea of what a solution is. And I think the biggest thing that entrepreneurs struggle with is having an idea of how to solve a problem, but not really understanding the problem fully so that they make sure the solution they're building is actually the right solution. Ideally, you're going to be starting a company from the place of actually trying to solve a problem that's a real user problem out in the world. But a lot of people come in and say, oh, I have this really cool technology or this really cool solution. Let's build that. It's much better to start actually with the problem. And if it takes you down an entirely different path than what you thought it would, you're more likely to be successful.
So where do you see startups being successful then? Like what do they do? What actions do they take for research?
Yeah, I'm thinking of a recent client I worked with, and they came to me, and the founder was one of the most pleasurable I have ever worked with, particularly because he had such an open mind. Um, so he recognized that there were issues in his industry, and he wanted to solve those problems, but he entirely was able to step back from what they had already built and what we're already trying such that we could actually go and investigate what people really needed and people really wanted and would pay money for, rather than focusing on what they had already built, which obviously wasn't entirely working. So he was so open-minded and humble and thoughtful about actually solving problems for real people. It really helped them get to a solution that would sell because people don't buy stuff that they don't want or need.
hmm So, and this is something I hear from startups a lot is like, how do we know if somebody will pay for this? So how do you usually think about that problem?
Um, One of the ways I usually tackle this is really using open-ended conversations as a place to start in terms of uncovering problems for people, because the reality is people don't always know what their problems are, what their needs are, what they want. So having open-ended conversations, particularly when you don't go in with an agenda, ends up revealing what the biggest problems for them are, because those are the things that come up organically. Those are the things that they'll tell you first. Those are the things um, that people really end up needing something to help them with. And when you're asking sort of more closed-ended questions about an industry or a problem or even a solution you've already built, you close off all of these alternate paths that probably would lead you to success. And these are the problems that are most important to people, which means you need to listen to them in a very, very open-minded, humble sort of way. You can't go in thinking you know what problem to solve. So the reason people buy stuff is because you're actually addressing something that matters to them. And they're if you put it in their language, if you put it in terms that they understand, the language they use, it is much easier to sell it to them too. So you're going to want to go into research thinking, all right, how are people talking about their problems? What words are they using? What matters to them? People will pay for things if they understand how it will help them. That is at the essence what sales and marketing is about. You want to convey your value to people. So people will buy something if they understand its value. I have sort of a way of thinking about the value that you bring. Essentially, if you have people buying your product, but like churning, then that means you probably have a problem like within the product in terms of either user experience or what problems you're solving. Whereas if you're having problems with people buying it in the first place, it's because people don't understand your value. And if they don't understand your value, it's either because you don't actually have value to them, or you might be marketing it the wrong way. So I would look at which part of the sort of the funnel you're having the most trouble with, and that actually helps you identify what kind of research to do.
And for I'd love to walk through each of those types of problems and give some examples of like what kinds of questions you ask or who you ask them to. So maybe starting at the very top. So if entrepreneurs are looking to figure out if they're really solving something that provides value, how should they find out? Who should they talk to?
So one of the things you want to think about is who is your actual market. I think there's a tendency to to go way too broad early on. I know I've heard plenty of VCs and stuff say this too, but you want to pick a very specific set of people that you are both marketing to and building your products for. So the first thing is actually to get really concrete and specific about that. And then those are the people you should be talking to. If you don't know what your market is, that's a separate question. And I could talk about that in a little bit. But once you choose that, so say it's, property managers for like HOAs, that could be a specific market you're trying to sell to. So you want to talk to them, even if they are not the buyer. So you want to talk to them and you want to really focus on what their days look like, what do they think are the most painful and frustrating part of their days, and how can you actually tap into that. You don't want to add anything extra on top of what they already do. You want to really build yourself into their workflow because that makes it so much easier to increase your adoption. So questions that I will ask will be like, tell me what your day was like yesterday. You want to keep the questions very specific and very recent because people have terrible memories. So questions you want to avoid are things like, tell me about the last time your computer broke. And if that was like 6 months ago, they aren't going to be able to give you the relevant details you want. Or you also want to prevent not ask questions about their future self. Like people are notoriously bad at predicting their own behavior. So asking questions like, would you buy this? Not going to give you any information. And more likely, it's going to misdirect you and cause you to think that information is useful. So avoid those questions at all costs. So ask them about like what they do, what their day looks like, how they feel during the day. Because people are buying, even in business context, is very emotional. So you really want to understand what people feel at certain points. Then you also want to understand what works for them right now and what doesn't work for them. What is what they think is their most painful like moment. And the best way to do this is really ask follow-up questions when they're telling you about their workflow, when they're telling you about specific tasks they do. So you will start to see that there are certain moments in their day that they find to be particularly frustrating. You want to dig there. You want to dig super deep and identify why. Why is this frustrating? What tools are you using? What are you doing? What are you not doing? Who are you interacting with? Essentially, the way I usually do my sessions with people is I don't come in with a script. I have a general set of topics and I choose from one of like 3 opening questions, which is like, tell me about who you are, tell me about, a recent day for you, and we go from there. It's pretty simple in theory.
So sometimes entrepreneurs in these early conversations can be quite enthusiastic about their solution. And so, what are your recommendations around whether or not to introduce the solution at this stage in the conversation?
Until you have really strong product market fit, you want to avoid conversations that are super about your solution because the feedback you need at this stage in your company is feedback about the problems you are solving and how well you are solving them. And your technology isn't going to necessarily be amazing at this stage. It's going to have, kinks to work out. But if you focus on that rather than actually solving really big problems in the market, you are going to get your information clouded. You will think that by solving, say, the like feature gaps in your product, that you're going to be moving forward. When in fact, what you really need to do is make sure you have a very tight fit with the problem that you're trying to solve.
And then so thinking about like the next step in the process and what research looks like there. So we covered, you know, just making sure you've got your value proposition down, like that you're solving a real problem. What about the like the marketing and the transition from, okay, I have this value prop, but they're still not signing up.
So if you really feel solid about your value prop and you really feel like it's solving an actual problem, and you have lots of evidence for this, and you as a founder, I realized I didn't answer this part during the last question. You as a founder have, or as someone who's really invested in the solution, has stepped back and let other people, say, do the interviews or run the sessions. That's one of my biggest recommendations for for not buying yourself, like biasing yourself. Really let other people run customer sessions if at all possible. If not, you want to do it, but you want to go in and essentially sort of slap yourself on the wrist mentally every time you bring up your solution. You want to essentially be sitting there and asking these entirely open-ended questions. In a way to frame it is, think about how you would ask your questions if you had nothing built, if you had no competitors, all that kind of fun stuff. Ask questions from this place of complete curiosity, open-endedness.
How do you get people once you do have your value proposition to become customers? Like what kind of research or questions do you ask?
Absolutely. So I think I already mentioned this a little bit, but you really want to start thinking about the language that your people are using to describe their problems to you. So you can go back and look at research you've already done. You can, there are various ways to do that. You can go on, if there's forums that have people writing about this particular issue, like if it's tech support forums or something, go and look and see what language people use. That is the first thing, because I have seen so many companies market themselves using language that, is very familiar to insiders, lots of jargon, but we don't think like that. And we also don't think like, we don't look for technical solutions usually. We want to solve a problem. So don't market your technical solution, market the problem that you are solving. So for example, like I help small businesses make more money by automating their expenses or something. That was literally just off the top of my head. That is you solving actual problem for real specific people. So that's one. You need to make sure you have that kind of language nailed down. Then you also have to think, where in their life or their job can you actually interject yourself? Because you know uh, this might seem somewhat self-explanatory, but I see it happen all the time. You don't want to be advertising like on Facebook for a deeply technical solution that addresses ERP needs. Like, people are not thinking about that when they are on Facebook. So are you actually reaching your people in the right place and at the right moments of time? So if you can find a way in particular to reach people when they are having the particular problem that you solve, that is the most powerful, because they will feel those emotions acutely in that very moment. Um, then another research activity you can do to see if you're nailing all of this is ask people what your product does. So ask your users, if you have any, what do they think you do, and get them to repeat it back to you in their words, because it is very informative when they think that your product does something entirely different than you think it does, or it solves a different problem than you market. That often is actually where you'll uncover the issue in terms of either your marketing or your sales process, and why people are not actually adopting it. Because as it turns out, there's a mismatch between their mental model and what you're selling.
Yeah. And I think the other thing too is like you can pivot the words you're using to mirror what they're saying. You can maybe reorganize the information based on what they say is most important. That's great.
Exactly.
Keep the user in the center. The other piece of the puzzle you brought up was like if an entrepreneur is struggling with churn, there's some different activities we might take. So, how would they know that they're suffering from this? Like, how do they know this is the piece of the puzzle to focus on? And then what should they do about it?
Yeah, churn's a really interesting one. So if you are to the point of actually having users churn, this is actually a mark of success because it means you have users who have the opportunity to churn. So first, give yourself a pat on the back. But but retention usually means that something is off in your user experience. So this is where actually really collaborating with someone who has expertise either in user research or user experience design or something very similar will probably behoove you because there's probably some part of your product, your solution, your experience that isn't working for people. Now, there are a couple of options. What option one is that you are not actually really solving the problem you think you solve. You were able to market it really well and sell it really well, but for whatever reason, there's a mismatch between, the problem and the solution. The way you uncover this is actually partially through that activity I just mentioned, where you're asking people to describe your product for you. So essentially, like, tell me what my product does if in 2 sentences. If they're describing something that's very different than what you think you're doing, that means you probably have a mismatch between, your sales and marketing and what your product actually does. So that's one question you can get to it. Another way to uncover the problems is really start doing observations, and this can be through analytics. I also recommend actually watching users do some of the core tasks in your product. So you want to identify what the core tasks you think people should be doing in your product, and then you want to watch people go through it. That is when you will uncover big issues and things that you might not think are a big deal end up really adding up for people. So the more often someone uses their software, the more often the little things end up mattering. So whether identifying if you have a retention problem, like should my numbers be higher? Essentially, you want to be keeping as many users as you possibly can. If your product is the kind of product that is addictive and really helpful and the kind of thing that people really want to use, they'll stick around, which means you can always improve your retention numbers. In fact, I think improving retention is actually more important long term than improving adoption numbers because that is more indicative of something actually solving a real problem. So always try to be improving your retention numbers no matter how good or bad they are. So don't think that you have a retention problem, assume that your retention can always be better.
One of the things that you have some expertise in is the differences between B2B versus B2C user research, user experience. I would love to hear about your perspective on that. What should entrepreneurs keep in mind depending on which of the spaces they're in?
Yeah, it's a really great question and something that I don't think gets nearly enough attention. The biggest thing that contextualizes differences between B2B companies and B2C companies is that there are in B2B companies, the buyer is often not the actual end user, which means um, you have to both sell and market to the buyer, but then you need to build a product that the end user actually will want to use. And this is another example where the retention is going to give you signal on this. So if you have no problem like selling and like getting people to buy your software and sign up for fancy packages and stuff, but you have issues with retention, I suspect in a B2B company, it's because you are addressing the needs of the buyer rather than the needs of the user. That would be like the first thing I would look at. Um, so you still have to address the needs of the buyer as well, though. So it's a delicate balancing act. And one of the biggest risks of serving the buyer is that they will keep asking you for more and more specific stuff. This is how B2B companies end up building a lot of almost custom software for these big companies that have bought their product because they, have these big dollar amounts attached to them. But then you get tied to it. Then you essentially are almost like a slave to these companies because if you don't get them what they want, they'll just abandon you, and you need that $10 million check because you're a startup, which means all of the development ends up focusing on the features that please the buyer and not the features that matter to the end user. It's a big problem. I have seen it happen multiple times in a lot of companies that are very successful, but continue to need to raise money. I think there's a quote from, I think, Mark Andreessen about this. Namely, if you are having to spend a lot of money on sales and marketing, that means you don't have product market fit. And I totally agree with that. So if you are having to spend a lot of money selling and marketing your software, that particularly in a B2B market, that means you haven't been serving your users and you are going to have problems long term. You need to shift your focus. Because if users don't want to use your software, it doesn't matter how much you appeal to buyers. Eventually, they will churn. You will no longer have that account. So that's one big thing. And that means you need to do research both with buyers and with the actual end users. Versus B2C, it's usually pretty acceptable and often they're the same person. Your job's a lot easier. B2B is actually harder in terms of user experience and user experience research. That's just an FYI, it's much harder. So when you're thinking of building B2B software, you're going to really have to have a strong vision and put a stake in the ground. And you're going to have to say no sometimes to some really big accounts and actually turn down money. I think the companies that tend to do best in this space are the ones who have a very strong vision about what they want to do, and they don't compromise it in any significant way for anyone. It means short term you might have lower growth, but I do think it's much more likely to build long term success.
So let's say we're an entrepreneur. If we have an entrepreneur listening today who's in the early days of a B2B product, like who are the first 10 people he should talk to or she should talk to? Should she be going for the buyer? Should she first talk to end users? What should that look like?
I highly recommend looking for end users because the best end users are going to sell for you. They just are. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that particularly successful business-to-business software often starts with small pods of people using something and then bringing it up the food chain. And this is great because then you have people within the company doing your selling for you. So you want to essentially start looking as early as possible for people who are likely to be your champions. I mean, that's the jargon term for it, but you want people who are going to be super passionate about what you do and be willing to be like, hey, can we use this product to do, our project management? I love it. In particular, products like Trello, that was their approach. I believe Atlassian, that was their approach. You want to start I think it is so much easier to start from the ground up. Then you also don't have to be worrying about the buyer as much. It's much more of a grassroots effort. So start with the end user. The buyers will follow if you're doing something right.
So what would you recommend is the right point to start doing research with buyers or having conversations with them?
I think it's probably when you start thinking about scaling. So that depends on the type of company, the industry, all that kind of stuff. But it's really when you want to start getting rapid growth with larger dollar amounts, things along those lines, because that's when you need to nail your sales and marketing funnel. So your marketing language needs to get super crisp. Your value prop needs to get super crisp. And obviously, if you're raising money, a lot of this stuff is going to get refined over time as you're pitching. But I think the growth stage, sort of at the beginning, you want to have all of the sort of pieces in place so you can iterate and learn as you're growing. But before that, before you find product market fit, really focus on your users rather than the buyers.
So one of the challenges I think entrepreneurs have is getting access to their audiences. Do you have any tips or tricks for listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. Scrappy research is kind of one of the things I've spent a lot of time doing. And of course, you hear all of these approach people in a coffee shop and buy them a cup of coffee, and they'll totally give you good feedback. That is great if your users are people who are in a coffee shop buying coffee, like that's the problem you're solving. But the reality is, most of the time, random people in coffee shops are not going to give you the kind of feedback that you want. So that's the bad news. The good news is that assuming your market exists in some way, shape, or form, which, spoiler alert, everyone does, even if you're creating a new market, there are places where people with those interests and people with the problems that you're solving hang out. So you want to think, where are these people spending their time? Maybe it's on a subreddit. Maybe it's on a LinkedIn group. Maybe it's in person, even though nowadays no one does stuff in person. Maybe it's in person at like a tech cafe or something. In which case, then you can go to the coffee shop because they hang out there. But um, you want to think about what these people are thinking and where they're spending their time. Then you go there to recruit them, because that is, if they are in their space, if they're comfortable, if you are speaking their language, they are much more likely to be receptive to you. But you want to be very careful about not selling people. You want to be very careful about actually being curious and listening to them. You are much more likely to get access to people if you treat them like a human being you're having a conversation with, rather than a sales prospect. So then you recruit in sort of the typical way you would do with research, where you say, I'm doing this kind of thing and I really could use their feedback, and I will give you a $10 gift card, or I will bake you cookies, or all sorts of things. Another way is, once you get like one person in an interview, you also can ask them if they know any people are similar to them. So that's another way. Um, but be scrappy. Really think about gaining access to your people, and you should be spending time in the places they hang out anyway, because that's a really good way to learn about what matters to them.
What percentage of the time should entrepreneurs use to be doing this research?
Honestly, I think research should be one of the core activities of the founding team in a founding, a startup that's trying to grow. I'm obviously biased, but from all of the companies I've interacted with and all the companies I've seen grow from like nothing to big things, the ones who spend a bunch of time listening to people and talking to people and trying to make sense of it are the ones that end up succeeding. It's not the people who spend all their time developing a solution. Just even think from an ROI perspective. Every hour you have a dev or even like a product manager working on it, something, it's an expensive hour. So if you can save yourself lots of money and lots of time by not making mistakes, by building them and putting them out on the market, um, you're going to be better off. I know there is often this mentality of like, build it and then put it out there and you'll get feedback on it. But hopefully we now have lots of evidence that doesn't always work. You want to start from a much more solid foundation and then put stuff out into the market and iterate. It is actually really costly and difficult to set up analytics and analyze them regularly and make sure you're asking the right questions. So you should have the build, measure, learn cycle, but it should be built on a solid foundation, so you aren't starting from a completely wrong place, because the analytics will only tell you information about what you already are building and already know. So like if you're building something that, is a rocket ship and no one wants to go to space, you're only going to get analytics about a rocket ship. When it turns out they just want a car, you won't know that from like looking at the build, measure, learn very easily. So it's much easier to be like, okay, people want to travel on the ground from place to place. So then you can figure out, do they want a car? Do they want a truck? Do they want a bike?
Yeah, that's a great analogy. Just a reminder that like sometimes we dream really big, but the problems are just much more tangible because it's like the real life
Yeah.
of people. As you've worked with startups over the years, what do you see are some of the common mistakes or issues in the early days?
Um, the biggest one is one that we've already touched on, which is really getting attached to your solution. Man, getting attached to the solution can be honestly one of the most costly things you can do, because actually building something and making it work usually can be expensive. I mean, nowadays there are a lot more resources to do things on the cheap, but it still takes time, and time is money, which is something that we always forget. So really don't get attached to your solution, because you will look for evidence that it's working. You will, like our brain literally look for evidence to reinforce our current belief. So if you want to find evidence, it will be there. So really try to step back and be unattached to your solution. Another big mistake is really also talking to the wrong people or listening to the wrong people when you're doing customer development research. This is why sort of being very specific about who you're marketing to, who you're building a product for, is so important. Doesn't mean you can't change it, doesn't mean you can't shift it, but you want very clear signal from a particular population that something is working or not working, so you can move on. Whereas you muddy the data if you are like all over the place, because maybe you are addressing one of their needs, but because you are, say, trying to tackle a whole population rather than a specific segment, then you get much less signal about how much it's working. What is another mistake that I see people make? Oh, throwing money at a problem. That's another fun one. There is a lot of wisdom in the idea that constraints create creativity. I think we have a tendency to assume that you need a lot of money to figure things out, that you need a lot of money to grow. Sometimes you do, but money can allow you to solve to essentially solve problems in a way that doesn't actually solve the problem. It's like the sales and marketing example from earlier. Like if you're spending a bunch of money on sales and marketing, you might be like converting people and getting them to buy your products, but you're spending a bunch of money on sales. That means something is not working. So by staying lean, by really thinking about how to solve an actual problem, you save yourself a lot of time and money in the long run. So I think that's another big one. Once you have a lot of money, really easy to solve a lot of problems that are not the real problem.
Megan, thank you so much for being on today. It was really great to hear your perspective on all these different stages and how to do research. I'm sure our audience took a lot of really valuable information home with them. Um, how can our audience find more about working with you?
My website is my first name dot my last or first name last name.com. It's in the show notes for how you spell my name. I work with entrepreneurs to really make sure that they have the right mindset and also the right tools at their disposal to build something that will actually change the world. I work with some of the best like change makers and social impact people on the planet, and they're going to do amazing things. So I definitely encourage you to reach out if that's something that might sound interesting to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Megan. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Thanks for listening to Startup Insights with AJ Davis. If you like our show and want to learn more, subscribe to our YouTube channel.